Loud music pulsed through the house, every beat vibrating through the walls and deep into my bones. The backyard was alive with laughter and splashes as guests jumped into the pool, carefree and drenched in the glow of string lights hanging overhead. It was our anniversary, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. The stress of work, bills, and life had melted away for just one evening. I stood at the edge of the pool with a drink in my hand, watching the festivities unfold, a wide grin plastered across my face. The party had been my wife's idea, and she'd gone above and beyond to make sure it was memorable. 40 people, maybe more, filled every corner of our home. Some were friends we saw regularly. Others were acquaintances, maybe co-workers of hers I hadn't met before. It didn't matter. Tonight, everyone was just here to have a good time, including me. I glanced across the patio and saw her sitting with her friends at one of the tables, dealing cards, her laughter ringing out above the music. She looked radiant under the dim lights, her face flushed with happiness as she threw her head back, laughing at some joke I couldn't hear from where I stood. I remember thinking how perfect everything felt at that moment. Our three-story home was packed with people, the air filled with the scent of grilled food, chlorine, and the unmistakable smell of summer nights. I was on my second, maybe third, drink, and the buzz had me feeling lighter than I had in months. I hadn't felt this carefree in what seemed like forever. My worries, all the little frustrations, seemed so far away tonight. I was just happy. I waved at a few people as I made my way through the crowded living room, heading to the makeshift bar we'd set up on the first floor. More drinks, more music. Some people danced. Others lounged on the couches or mingled in small groups, drinks in hand. The energy in the house was electric. I spotted a few friends from work and made my way over to them, grabbing a beer on the way. We exchanged small talk, joking about how wild the night had already gotten and how it seemed like things were just getting started. As the night wore on, the energy kept building. It wasn't just the alcohol coursing through my veins. It was the sense that everything was finally going right. My wife, Laura, was at ease, her face glowing under the lights as she played cards with her friends, occasionally glancing over at me with a smile. I remember catching her eye at one point, and we exchanged a knowing look. This was exactly what we needed. We'd been so bogged down with work, stress, and the monotony of daily life that a night like this felt like a revival of the spark between us. The hours passed in a blur. The music kept pumping, people kept coming and going, and the drinks never seemed to stop. By around 8 p.m., I was feeling the weight of all the alcohol I consumed. I found myself lying back on one of the couches in the living room, watching the ceiling spin above me. The house was still full of people, though some had started to leave while others were just arriving. The front door opened and closed every few minutes as new faces popped in and old ones waved goodbye. I was drunk, maybe a little too drunk, but in that blissful, hazy state, everything still felt perfect. Laura was still sitting with her friends, deep in conversation and laughter. I could see them from where I lay, their group bathed in the warm glow of the overhead lights. I lifted my beer, taking a long, slow sip, savoring the coolness of it as it slid down my throat. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the distant sounds of the party wash over me. Then something snapped me out of my half-asleep daze. A loud voice from somewhere in the house cut through the music and laughter like a blade. "Hey dude, a crowd of people is banging your wife." My eyes shot open. I sat up too quickly, the room spinning as I tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. For a moment, I froze, my mind racing. It had to be a joke. Someone was trying to mess with me. That's what people did at parties, right? Someone was just playing a cruel prank. I shook my head, smiling weakly to myself as I tried to laugh it off. It couldn't be true. Laura was right there, sitting with her friends. There was no way. I settled back onto the couch, willing my racing heart to slow down. I took another sip of my beer, trying to push the thought out of my mind. It was just some idiot trying to get a rise out of me, I told myself. No big deal. But then, just as I started to relax, I heard another shout, this one even louder and clearer, echoing from the staircase. "There's a swinger party on the third floor. Who wants to join in?" I felt my body go cold. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the words sank in. Swinger party? In my house? My mind reeled, grasping for an explanation. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. Not tonight, not here. My heart pounded in my chest, the once comforting beat of the music, now a sickening backdrop to the panic rising inside me. I sat up fully now, my drunken haze clearing just enough to focus. My eyes darted toward the stairs, toward the third floor, where a group of people was gathered at the base. I hadn't been up there in hours, hadn't paid much attention to who was going up or down. It was just part of the party, right? I told myself not to overthink it, but the sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I could hear more voices now, people talking excitedly, laughing, and something else, the unmistakable sound of moaning drifting down the stairs. My stomach twisted as I listened, a wave of nausea hitting me. Was this actually happening? I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. The beer in my hand sloshed onto the floor as I stumbled toward the stairs, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. The rational part of me was trying to tell myself that it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe someone was exaggerating, or maybe I was just too drunk and hearing things wrong. But with each step I took toward the third floor, the sounds grew louder, more undeniable. As I reached the staircase, a few people passed me, laughing and talking as if nothing was out of the ordinary. They didn't seem concerned, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that clawed at me. I pushed past them, gripping the banister for support as I climbed the stairs. Every step felt like it was dragging me closer to something I didn't want to see, something that could unravel everything I'd thought was perfect about the night. The sounds from the third floor became clearer the higher I climbed. Laughter, talking, and beneath it all, those moans. I paused halfway up the stairs, gripping the rail tightly as my breath came in shallow gasps. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. I wanted to turn around, to go back to the couch, back to pretending everything was fine. But I couldn't. I had to know. I reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner. The sight that met my eyes nearly knocked the breath out of me. There, in the middle of the room, was a group of people gathered around as if watching some kind of spectacle. My heart raced as I pushed my way through the crowd, my vision blurring as I tried to make sense of the noises, the bodies moving together. It all hit me at once. This was real. And then, through the chaos, my eyes found her. My wife, Laura. She was right there, on her knees in front of a man I didn't recognize, her hands on him, her mouth. My mind screamed at me to stop looking, to turn away, but I couldn't. The image burned itself into my brain, searing with the kind of pain I never thought I'd feel. She was right there in the center of it all, performing oral sex on a guy, a fat, sweaty guy I didn't recognize. Her head moved in a rhythm that made my blood boil, my vision going red. I couldn't comprehend it. I couldn't process the image in front of me. My wife, the woman I'd loved, the woman I trusted, the one I'd been celebrating with just moments ago, was down on her knees, pleasing another man while our friends watched, while her friends were doing the same vile acts. I froze for a second, paralyzed by the betrayal searing through me. I wanted to scream, to tear the room apart. But for a moment, all I could do was stand there, watching in horror as the woman I thought I knew showed me a side of her I never could have imagined. A side that shattered everything I believed in. Then, someone nearby saw me, smirking as if this whole thing was just a fun game. "Relax, man. Come join us." That was it. The final straw. Something snapped inside me. All the anger, the humiliation, the disgust, it erupted like a volcano. I wasn't thinking anymore. I couldn't. My body acted on pure rage. I grabbed the nearest chair, a heavy wooden one, and swung it at the guy who had the nerve to suggest I join in. The chair connected with his shoulder, sending him crashing into a table. The crack of wood splintering filled the room, followed by gasps, screams, and chaos. The man groaned, clutching his shoulder, but I didn't care. I was beyond caring. The room spun as I turned toward Laura, who had now noticed the commotion. She stopped what she was doing, wiping her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Shock that I was there, that I had seen everything. But instead of shame or guilt, her expression was one of fear. Fear of what I was going to do next. What the fuck is this? I screamed, my voice hoarse from the rage surging through me. I couldn't control myself, couldn't stop the words from spilling out. What the hell are you doing? People started to back away as I charged forward, fists clenched, eyes locked on the man she had been with. One of the men, clearly seeing how out of control I was, stepped in, trying to calm me down, but his mere presence sent me over the edge. "Don't touch me," I yelled, shoving him back with all the strength I had. He stumbled, but before he could recover, I lunged at him, swinging wildly. My fists connected with his face, his body, anything I could hit. The sounds of the party faded into the background, drowned out by the roaring in my ears, the pounding of my heart. All I could see was the betrayal. All I could feel was the seething fury tearing me apart. He tried to fight back, his hands coming up to block my blows, but I didn't care. I didn't care if I was hurting him or if I was going to get hurt. I just wanted to destroy something. Someone, anything that could make the pain go away, even for a second. Behind me, Laura screamed. I heard her voice, high-pitched, frantic, but I couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. She was part of this. She had done this. Suddenly, I felt hands grab me from behind, pulling me off the guy. I thrashed wildly, still swinging, still trying to break free, but more people stepped in, holding me back. I didn't even know who they were. Friends? Strangers? I couldn't tell anymore. "Stop, man. You're going to kill him," someone shouted, but the voice barely registered through the haze. I turned my head, trying to catch a glimpse of Laura through the chaos. But everything was a blur of movement. Bodies everywhere. People yelling, screaming. Some of the women, Laura's friends, were crying now, as if the reality of the situation had finally sunk in. Someone, one of the guys from earlier, pushed his way toward Laura, standing in front of her like he was protecting her. Like I was the one who needed to be stopped. That was all it took. The sight of him standing there, shielding her from me, as if I was the villain in this twisted nightmare, made something inside me snap completely. I broke free from the people holding me, charging at him with everything I had left. My body was exhausted, my mind barely functioning, but I didn't care. He was just another obstacle in the way of making her pay, making her feel the same hurt she had inflicted on me. I tackled him to the ground, fists flying, hitting anything I could reach. I could hear the sounds of more people rushing in, trying to pull me off, trying to stop the madness, but I wouldn't stop. I couldn't. This wasn't just about the man beneath me. This was about everything. About Laura. About what she had done to me, to us, to our marriage. The sounds of the room became deafening. People yelling, girls screaming, some of them calling for help. Panic was spreading like wildfire, the party turning into a full-blown brawl. I could hear the crunch of fists connecting with faces, the dull thud of bodies hitting the floor, but none of it registered. All I could focus on was the anger coursing through my veins. I felt hands on me again, pulling me back, but this time I didn't fight it. I was too spent, too drained to keep going. My chest heaved with every breath, my vision swimming as the adrenaline started to fade. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was Laura, standing in the middle of the chaos, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. And behind her, the fat guy she'd been with, smirking like he'd just won. It was chaos. Pure, unfiltered chaos. The moment I tackled the guy who had stepped in for my wife, the entire room seemed to explode. Everything blurred into a flurry of fists, bodies crashing together, and voices rising in an indistinguishable roar. My knuckles collided with his face again and again, but the anger inside me didn't subside. I barely registered the pain in my hands as they split open from the impact. All I felt was rage. Blood. It was everywhere, and I wasn't even sure whose it was anymore, his, mine, or someone else's. The party had turned into a war zone, and the violence spiraled out of control with every passing second. People were shouting, trying to pull me off the guy, but others were screaming in panic as the entire scene escalated into a brawl. Punches flew wildly, the sounds of skin against skin, and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor echoed around the room. I could hear glass shattering somewhere, followed by a woman's shriek as she backed away from the chaos, hands over her face in fear. It wasn't just me and him anymore. Fists were swinging in every direction. Other guests had joined the fray, trying to defend their friends, trying to break it up, or simply caught up in the violence. I couldn't tell. A guy I didn't even recognize lunged at me, trying to pull me off the man I was pummeling. I shoved him back, not caring who he was, not caring about anything except the burning desire to make anyone feel the same pain I did. I barely registered it when I heard a loud crash beside me, a table or a chair being thrown aside as someone was knocked into it. Screams rang out louder, and I could hear the distinct sound of a woman sobbing. The fight had spread like a wildfire, and now it was out of anyone's control. Things flew through the air, bottles, chairs, whatever people could get their hands on. I caught a glimpse of someone swinging a lamp across the room, smashing it against the wall as they tried to fend off an attacker. Blood ran down my face, dripping into my eyes, but I couldn't stop. I didn't even know where the blood had come from. I didn't care. I kept hitting the guy in front of me until my arms screamed in protest, until I couldn't feel anything but the raw intensity of the moment. Every hit felt like it would be the one to end it all, but nothing was enough. The anger, the betrayal, the humiliation, they were bottomless pits I couldn't fill, no matter how many punches I threw. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, I felt a sharp, blinding pain explode in the back of my head. A boot. Someone had kicked me hard. My vision blurred instantly, and the world spun violently as I lost my balance and hit the ground. My face slammed into the floor with a painful thud, and for a split second, I couldn't move. The pain shot through my skull like a bullet, ringing in my ears as I gasped for air, stunned. My body felt heavy, my limbs weak, but I knew I had to get up. I had to keep fighting. But before I could even lift myself off the floor, another blow landed, this time in my stomach. The force of it knocked the wind out of me, and I curled into myself instinctively, gasping, choking on the pain as I clutched my ribs. It felt like my insides were on fire, the agony tearing through my body with every breath. I tried to push myself up, to crawl away, but then another kick landed, this time to my side, sending a shockwave of pain through my entire body. I couldn't even scream. All I could do was curl tighter, shielding myself as best I could as more kicks rained down on me. It was like the entire room had turned on me. I felt blow after blow, on my legs, my back, my ribs. I was surrounded, and the pain was unbearable, radiating from every part of me. The voices around me blurred into a cacophony of yelling, cursing, and the high-pitched shrieks of people either terrified or enraged. I couldn't tell which anymore. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as the hits kept coming. I thought I was going to die. The thought was as clear as day in my mind as I lay there, helpless under the relentless assault. I had no control anymore. The pain was too much, too intense, and my body was shutting down. I could feel it, the way my limbs stopped responding, the way my vision darkened around the edges, the way my chest tightened with every failed attempt to suck in air. The punches and kicks seemed to merge into one endless wave of agony. My screams echoed in my own head, but I wasn't sure if I was even making a sound anymore. It didn't matter. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't fight. Somewhere in the distance, I heard my friends shouting, pleading for the madness to stop, but they were caught in the brawl too. I could hear the thud of fists landing, grunts of pain as they tried to fight off whoever had turned on us. They were in it just as deep as I was, and the chaos showed no signs of letting up. Then, through the fog of pain, I heard it, faint at first but unmistakable, the distant wail of sirens. The police. I wanted to feel relief, wanted to believe that help was on the way and this nightmare was almost over, but it was too late for that. The damage had already been done. Just as the thought crossed my mind, I felt another blow, a different kind this time. Something hard, something that shattered on impact. A beer bottle. It smashed over the back of my head, and for a moment, I saw nothing but white-hot pain. I crumpled to the floor completely, my body limp, my consciousness slipping away. The world dimmed around me, the sounds of the fight fading into a distant hum as I drifted in and out of awareness. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of someone screaming. Whether it was a cry for help or a wail of terror, I couldn't tell. Then nothing. Just darkness. When I woke up, The world felt heavy. Every part of my body ached, a deep, bone-crushing pain that I couldn't escape, no matter how much I tried to shift. My eyes blinked open slowly, adjusting to the dim light filtering into the hospital room. The sterile smell of disinfectant, the rhythmic beeping of machines, and the tight pull of bandages around my limbs all hit me at once. Groaning, I tried to move, but it was like my entire body was locked in place. My arms, my legs, everything hurt. It felt like all my bones had been shattered, and maybe they had. My right arm was encased in a thick, white cast, and my ribs screamed with pain even as I tried to take a shallow breath. There was a heavy bandage wrapped around my head, tight enough that I could feel the throb of my pulse beneath it. As my vision came into focus, I realized I wasn't alone. Sitting across from me, slumped in a chair, was a man in a uniform, an officer. His cap rested on his knee, and his eyes were trained on me, waiting. As soon as he saw my eyes open, he straightened up, the corners of his mouth twitching into a tired smile. "Oh, finally! I thought you'd never wake up," he said, his voice breaking the silence in the room. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a rasping groan. My throat was dry, and every word felt like sandpaper scraping against the inside of my mouth. The officer shifted in his chair and leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "You've been out for 5 days," he continued, his tone now more measured, as though he was carefully delivering a diagnosis. "You've got broken arms, a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a fracture in your leg. Took quite a beating. 5 days?" My mind struggled to grasp the concept. How long had I been lying here, unconscious, while the world continued without me? The officer watched me carefully, giving me time to process everything. "You're lucky, though," he said, shaking his head. "It could have been worse. When we got to your house, it was chaos. Naked girls crying, men fighting. The whole place was like something out of a nightmare." I winced, the memories of that night slowly trickling back into my mind, one painful fragment at a time. The brawl, the screams, the blows raining down on me from every direction. My chest tightened as I remembered the moment everything went black, that final crash of a beer bottle shattering over my skull. There was a fight, I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. The officer nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, there sure was. When we arrived, the place was a war zone. Took a while to break it up. Most of the guys who were there are being held at the precinct. But I need to hear your side of the story." He leaned forward, his notebook ready. I struggled to pull my thoughts together. The pain in my body made it hard to think clearly, but I knew I had to tell him everything. Piece by piece, I began to explain. It wasn't easy. The words were slow, broken, but I managed to relay the nightmare that had unfolded in my own home. The party, the chaos upstairs, the swinger party that had turned my world upside down. As I talked, the officer scribbled notes, his face unreadable. I didn't hold back. I told him about Laura, how I found her with another man, how I had lost control, and how the fight spiraled into madness. By the time I finished, the officer sat back in his chair, his expression tight. "I can see why you reacted the way you did," he said after a long pause. "But here's the thing. The people we've been interrogating are saying you started the fight. They're blaming you for everything." His words hit me like a hammer to the chest. Blaming me? I was the victim. They had been the ones in my house, turning my home into a disgusting spectacle. And yet, here I was, lying in a hospital bed while they pointed fingers at me. The guys involved could face up to 5 years in prison, the officer continued, tapping his pen against the side of the notebook. "But I need you to understand, it's a complicated situation. The moment you started throwing punches, everything changed. Some of them are playing the victim now." I wanted to scream, to argue, but I didn't have the strength. My ribs throbbed with every breath, and my head was spinning from the effort of even staying conscious. All I could do was lie there, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his words settling over me like a suffocating blanket. "Rest," the officer said, standing up and slipping his notebook into his pocket. "I'll be back in a few days with some updates. Try not to stress too much, all right?" Easy for him to say. I gave a weak nod, watching as he headed toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, something clicked in my mind. Laura. I hadn't asked about her. Wait, I croaked, my voice strained. What about my wife? What happened to her? The officer paused, his hand resting on the doorframe as he turned back to me. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, something he was holding back. She's not here, he said slowly. After the fight, she had some kind of breakdown. She's been checked into a psychiatric hospital. The words knocked the wind out of me, as if another blow had landed square in my gut. A psychiatric hospital? Laura? The woman who had been on her knees with another man in our home, who had been the catalyst for the entire nightmare, was now in a psychiatric facility? It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. My mind reeled as the officer's words sunk in. She was gone. My wife, my betrayer, wasn't even facing the consequences of her actions. She was somewhere else, shielded by doctors and walls, while I was here, lying broken and defeated. The officer didn't linger. He gave me one last nod before stepping out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The silence felt deafening. Everything that had happened swirled in my mind, the images of that night flashing like a nightmare reel I couldn't shut off. The room spun, and before I knew it, hot tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. I wasn't even sure what I was crying for. Was it the pain, the betrayal, the fact that everything I had known was now a pile of ashes at my feet? Or was it because I realized in that moment that I had lost everything? I cried harder than I had in years. My sobs echoed off the sterile walls, and the pain in my ribs only made it worse. I couldn't hold it in. Everything was ruined. My life, my marriage, my home. A month passed, and the hospital finally discharged me. But I wasn't the same man who had entered that place. My body had healed, mostly. My arms were no longer in casts, and the throbbing pain in my ribs had dulled to an ache. But the deeper wounds, the ones inside, still festered. I was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed by doctors. When I got home, the emptiness hit me immediately. The house, our house, felt hollow. The once lively walls that had echoed with laughter, music, and life were now silent, cold. I stood in the entryway, looking around at the familiar furniture and decorations, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Everything was stained by the memories of that night. I could almost hear the distant sounds of the party, the laughter, the moans, the chaos. I could still picture her, Laura, on her knees, betraying me in front of a crowd while I stood helpless, watching my life unravel. I dropped my bag and sank onto the couch, my head resting against the cushions. The silence pressed down on me like a heavy weight. I had no idea what to do with myself. The last month had been a blur of pain, confusion, and endless questions. How had everything fallen apart so fast? How had the woman I loved become the source of my destruction? My mind wandered back to Laura. The last update from the officer still echoed in my ears. Psychiatric hospital. She had been institutionalized after some kind of breakdown, but I couldn't reconcile that image with the woman I'd seen, the woman who had so carelessly shattered our life together. I wasn't sure why, but suddenly I had the overwhelming urge to see her. Maybe it was closure I needed. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe, deep down, I wanted to confront her one last time. I didn't know, but something inside me pushed me to go. I couldn't ignore the gnawing need to face her, to look her in the eyes and demand to know why. I grabbed my keys, forcing myself up from the couch, and without thinking too much about it, I drove straight to the psychiatric center. The drive was a blur, my mind racing, the streets passing by like the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. By the time I pulled up to the facility, my heart was pounding in my chest. The building loomed in front of me, sterile and cold, much like the hospital I'd just left behind. When I walked in, everything felt surreal. The receptionist barely looked up as I asked to see her, confirming her name, Laura Jensen, before buzzing me through. The halls were eerily quiet as I made my way to her room. Each step felt heavier, as if the air itself was thick with tension, pressing against me the closer I got. I didn't know what to expect when I saw her, but I wasn't ready for what I found. There she was sitting by the window, staring out into nothing. She looked hollow. Her skin was pale, and her eyes, once bright and full of life, were red and empty, as if the fire inside her had been snuffed out. She didn't even notice me at first. "Laura," I said softly, my voice barely carrying through the room. She turned, her gaze locking on me, and in an instant, something dark flared behind those vacant eyes. Before I could react, she was on her feet, rushing at me. "It's all your fault," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria as she lunged at me. "You did this to me. You put me here." I stumbled back, shocked at the venom in her voice. She was like a wild animal, completely unhinged. She began to grab at anything within reach, a lamp, a chair, her hands trembling with rage as she hurled them across the room. Objects crashed to the floor, shattering against the walls. "It's your fault. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here. You ruined everything," she screamed, her voice piercing the air like a knife. For a moment, I stood there frozen, watching her tear through the room like a whirlwind of anger and bitterness. And then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. The months of confusion, of pain, of feeling like I had lost everything, all of it came flooding to the surface. "My fault," I shouted back, my voice rising with my own fury. "If it weren't for you, none of this would have happened." Her eyes widened as she flinched at my words, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. "You destroyed our marriage. You betrayed me. You turned our home into a circus, and now you're blaming me?" For 2 minutes, we were at each other's throats, shouting over one another, words flying like daggers in the air. Her face twisted with fury, and for a moment, I saw the real Laura, the one who had done all of this. Not the broken woman in front of me, but the selfish, heartless woman who had turned my life into a living nightmare. The shouting grew louder until staff members rushed in, pulling me away as Laura's breakdown escalated. She screamed, throwing herself at the walls, tears streaming down her face, her voice cracking under the weight of her anger. I was forcibly removed, dragged down the hallway as she screamed behind me. I could hear her voice echoing through the halls, blaming me for everything, her shrill cries following me even after I left the building. When I finally got back to my car, the rage inside me twisted into something darker. How could she blame me? After everything she did, she was the one who had destroyed everything. She was the one who had shattered our marriage, our life, and yet she had the audacity to act like I was the reason she was in that hospital. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, my head resting against the steering wheel as the tears came again. I had lost everything, my home, my marriage, my sense of self. The weight of it all was unbearable. I cried until my chest hurt, until I had nothing left to give. And then the anger returned, the fury, the memory of those men, those disgusting men who had been part of the party, who had touched or used her, flooded my mind. They had posted bail. They were out there, walking free, probably laughing about everything that had happened while I lay in a hospital bed, while my life crumbled around me. I couldn't take it anymore. I spent the next few days tracking them down. It wasn't hard. Their lives weren't as hidden as they thought. I found out everything, where they lived, where they worked, and one afternoon, I drove to one of their homes. It was a quiet suburban street, the kind where people pretend nothing bad ever happens. I saw him there, the man I had fought that night. The man who had been with Laura. He was outside, washing his windows, a smug look on his face, completely unaware of what was about to happen. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the weapon I'd brought with me, a crowbar I'd taken from the garage, and stormed toward him. He didn't even see me coming until it was too late. The first blow landed squarely on his back, sending him crashing to the ground with a scream. I swung again, harder this time, the metal connecting with his side. He howled in pain, crying, begging for me to stop, but I didn't. I kept hitting him, over and over, the anger inside me driving every blow. His screams grew weaker, his pleas for mercy barely a whisper as I rained down punishment for everything he had done, for everything they had done. And then there was silence. He stopped moving. His cries stopped. His body lay still, crumpled on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. I stood there, breathless, the crowbar slipping from my hands as reality crashed over me. I had gone too far. I had lost control. Panic set in. I didn't even check if he was still alive. I just turned and ran. I fled, leaving behind the wreckage of my anger and my life. I didn't go home. I couldn't. My hands were still shaking, my knuckles raw and bruised from the beating I'd just given that man. His screams echoed in my mind as I drove aimlessly, not caring where I was headed, just knowing I needed to get away. Far away. I could still feel the weight of the crowbar in my hands, the sickening crack of it connecting with his body, replaying over and over in my head. What had I done? What kind of man had I become? The tears started falling before I even realized it. Hot, desperate sobs that racked my chest and blurred my vision. I had completely lost control. I had acted out of pure rage, and now I didn't even know if he was dead or alive. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I tried to steady myself, but the guilt was suffocating. I wasn't this person. I wasn't a killer. But at that moment, it felt like I had no other choice. It felt like the only way to reclaim something, anything, of the life that had been stolen from me. I drove for what felt like hours, my chest heavy, my mind spiraling. I didn't have a plan. I was just fleeing from the mess I'd left behind. At some point, through the tears and the haze, I realized where I was heading, a small cabin I owned out of town. It was hidden deep in the woods, a place barely anyone knew about, especially not Laura. It was a little escape, something I had bought years ago for weekends when I wanted to get away from everything. Funny, I had almost forgotten it existed until now. It was about 3 hours away, nestled in a tiny village with a population of only 550 people. A world so different from the madness I just left behind. No one would find me there. No one even knew I was coming. The further I drove, the quieter everything became. The chaotic roar of my thoughts slowly dulled into a numb silence as the city streets faded into long, winding country roads. My tears had stopped, but the tightness in my chest remained. Regret, thick and suffocating, clung to me like a second skin. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun beginning to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the driveway. The place looked exactly as I had left it, a small, run-down cabin tucked away behind thick woods, hidden from the world. No one would bother me here. No one would ask questions. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the porch, my legs heavy with exhaustion. Every step felt like it took all the strength I had left, and by the time I reached the front door, I felt completely drained. I fumbled with the keys, barely able to get the lock to turn, and when the door finally creaked open, I walked inside and collapsed into the nearest chair. And then I cried. I cried harder than I ever had before. My body shook with the force of it as I buried my face in my hands, the tears coming in waves that I couldn't control. Everything hit me all at once. What I'd done, what I'd become, what I'd lost. In a single day, my life had disintegrated into something I no longer recognized. Laura's betrayal, the destruction of our marriage, my assault on that man, the guilt and the rage twisted inside me like a knife. How had I ended up here? How had I let it all go so wrong? I stayed like that for hours, curled up in the chair, my mind spinning with regret. I thought about everything that had led me to this point. Laura's betrayal replayed in my head, that terrible image of her with another man seared into my memory forever. How could she have done this? How could she have humiliated me like that, in front of all those people, with no regard for the life we had built? She didn't love me. That much was clear now. If she had, she wouldn't have done what she did. She wouldn't have organized that disgusting party right in front of my eyes, surrounded by her friends, by strangers, by men who took pleasure in ruining what little dignity I had left. She didn't care about me. If she ever had, that version of her was long gone. As I sat there, replaying it all in my head, I began to realize the truth. If it hadn't been for her, none of this would have happened. She had been the one who orchestrated everything. She had torn our life apart, brought strangers into our home, and turned it into something dark and twisted. And I had reacted. I had been driven by emotions, by anger, humiliation, and the need for revenge. But those emotions had ruined me. I recognized that now. Every decision I had made in the last few months had been driven by feelings I couldn't control. And in the end, I had let them destroy me. Laura's betrayal had lit the match, but I had been the one who let the fire consume everything. I stayed in that cabin for 2 months, refusing to go back to the life I had left behind. I couldn't face it. I couldn't face the reality of what I'd done or what had been done to me. Every day, I woke up with the same crushing sense of emptiness, the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a heavy stone. The guilt, the regret, it never went away. I barely ate. I barely slept. I just sat in that chair, staring out the window at the trees, replaying the same thoughts over and over. Laura's face, her eyes full of that same mix of fear and rage from the psychiatric center. The man's screams as I beat him, the sound of the crowbar hitting his body. It all played like a loop in my mind, never letting me rest. Eventually, though, I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I had to go back. I had to see what was left of my life, even if it meant facing the wreckage I had created. So, one morning, I packed up what little I had and drove back to the house. The drive felt longer this time, heavier, like I was moving through molasses. By the time I reached the city, my heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to expect when I pulled up to my house, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. It was gone. The house, my home, had been burned down. I sat in the car, staring in disbelief at the charred remains of what had once been the place I had shared with Laura. There was nothing left but ash and rubble. The front yard, once neatly trimmed and full of life, was scorched, blackened. The windows were shattered, the roof collapsed in on itself. It looked like a war zone. Everything was gone. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaking beneath me as I walked up to the ruins. My hands clenched into fists as I stared at the destruction in front of me. I had lost everything. First my marriage, then my dignity, and now, even my home. It felt like the final nail in the coffin.